Today, I'm excited to welcome Richard Byworth to the podcast. Richard is a partner at Seas Capital, investing in hedge funds, board member of Relay, advisor to Jan3, and host of Seize the Future podcast. Welcome to the Bitcoin Edge, Richard.
Thank you, Paula. Very happy to be here.
It is great to see you. So before we get to Bitcoin, tell me a little bit about your background and about yourself.
Sure. So I was, in my early career, I was an investment banker. I was a trader of convertible bonds. Started my career in London. I moved to Tokyo after 5 years in London. Did 5 years in Tokyo. That saw me into the financial crisis and the collapse of Lehman Brothers, at which point I ended up inheriting all of Lehman Brothers' derivative distribution teams into my team. So I ended up running distribution for convertible bonds, Delta One, derivatives, futures and options into the last part of my investment banking career. I did that. I then moved a year after the financial crisis. I moved to Hong Kong to continue that with Mngr again. I basically left in 2017. I was going to be joining a private equity company, but actually I had my head turned by a mining company that I'd invested in. The founder asked me to help him build basically the financial services arm of that business, which we did. We built it very aggressively. We listed the company on NASDAQ in September 2020 via a SPAC. And then about a year later, Binance approached us because we had a lot of licenses and they wanted to acquire the company. And the chairman and the board were very keen to do that. So I stepped down at the end of 2021. I didn't want to get involved in that whole thing. So I stepped down and I was just sitting on the beach and Mark Seas of Seas Capital gave me a call and he said, "Rich, do you want to run my hedge fund business?" I said, "Sure. There's a couple of things I'd need to do, and that's to keep my hand in with Bitcoin and broader digital assets." And he agreed that we could launch a fund of crypto hedge funds, which is something we did in partnership with Willy Woo. And the other thing was, when I joined the firm, I looked at it, I said, "Look, this firm has probably some of the best product I've ever seen of any firm looking at private equity, hedge funds, litigation finance." I said, "The problem is no one's ever heard of the name Seas." So that's why we ended up launching Seize the Future podcast to just show, just a different way of thinking about things. And then while I've been here in Switzerland, I got to know Relay, the DCA brokering company, because when I orange pill people, I need to have somewhere for them to go and buy their Bitcoin. And Swiss people tend to always want a Swiss company. And I met Julian, the founder, and I was immediately very impressed by him. Super hardworking, driven, ambitious young guy and super smart. And then the Jan3 thing came about. Really, it was in Miami in 2023 that I met Samson, and I was introducing him to some government people from Argentina. And then in Nashville, actually, we ended up having a conversation just because things progressed further, and we ended up agreeing that I would join the firm as an advisor. So that's the whole picture you have there, Paul.
So that must keep you quite busy.
It does, yeah. It really does.
So how did you find Bitcoin?
Bitcoin, for me, it was actually, I was probably one of the very early people to hear about Bitcoin because there was a young kid on my desk who'd actually moved over with the Lehman team. I was still in Tokyo at the time, which means it was before the end of 2009. And he kept talking about Bitcoin, which he discovered on some internet forum somewhere, with our head of quant research on the portfolio trading desk. And so these two guys were just geeking out about Bitcoin most days. And I was like, "Guys, please, you're trying to sell derivatives. Will you please get on the phone to some hedge funds and sell derivatives and stop talking about what is clearly a scam on the internet?" And which is, it's a very normal response from a TradFi person. Don't understand it. It's on the internet. Sounds weird. People who grew up before the internet didn't even trust to put their credit card details on the internet. So the idea of money on the internet was clearly a scam. And so that's what I assumed. But then in 2017, when I took my kids to Club Med skiing in Japan, where you could literally drop off your kids in their pajamas to ski school and they'd get taken out for the day, I actually read the first book I'd read since my kids were born, which was Sapiens by Yuval Harari. And I agreed with a lot of the ideas that he was sort of articulating in that book, but he kept talking about Bitcoin. And the last time I'd heard about Bitcoin, I'd assumed it was some scam on the internet. I was like, well, okay, he seems to be quite thoughtful on everything else. Maybe there's something I should look at here. So I remember coming back from that holiday and saying to my grad on the desk, a kid called Herman, I said, Herman, I don't understand what this Bitcoin thing is, but please just go out and buy one Bitcoin for everyone on the desk. There was 8 people in the Hong Kong office at that point. And so, I said, let's spend $8,000 because Bitcoin was $1,000 at the time. Buy a Bitcoin for everyone on the desk. Then I took a sabbatical because it was coming up to the point where I decided to leave banking just over the summer. And I came back and Bitcoin had gone to 3,000. And I said, Herman, did you buy that Bitcoin? And he's like, I thought you were joking. So in the end, that was when I said, okay, I really need to work out how to buy it myself. I got an account with Bitstamp after looking at a few fairly shady places. And I didn't actually buy Bitcoin straight away. I bought Litecoin. I invested a few $1,000s and it went up 5x. And I was just looking, I was like, what is happening here? And so that was really how, at the end of that year, I ended up joining the crypto company. And so within my journey within the crypto company, I ended up really understanding Bitcoin and becoming a Bitcoin maxi and basically fully down the rabbit hole. And so, that's the Bitcoin one.
So you had quite a few touch points. What do you think most people need to really get Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think when I speak to people about their own journeys, it's very often not the first time. You often ignore it, and for me, it was even the second time I was buying Litecoin, and so I think what you need to do is really have a step back and think about what is money. And I think you need to be prepared to be very humble about that and say, I didn't really understand money in the first place. I remember in 2008 when the crisis happened, I'd got to the point of saying this whole money printing insanity that we're doing to try and support the financial institutions is going to be the death of fiat currency. So I was already sort of on this trajectory of I need to buy gold. I need to just get away from fiat as much as I possibly can, even rather than fully allocating to borrow money to allocate to make sure that I'm depreciating in the borrowed money. So I was already down this mindset. What I hadn't understood as someone, and I think for me, it really clicked when I understood that Bitcoin was limited at 21 million. When I understood that and I understood the expanse of the Bitcoin network, just that first mover advantage that had initially managed to get Bitcoin set off on its way, but also the fact that there's no founder behind it, you suddenly realize this is an entirely immaculate conception of a new money. And I think that was for me the real realization point for grokking Bitcoin, as you say.
So do you think we're still early in the Bitcoin cycle?
In this particular cycle, I think we're early, yes. I think we've only really started moving. I mean, if you look at Google Trend Analytics, we only just started picking up. And even then, I mean, with Bitcoin being at 100,000, I think many people had anticipated that we would be, much more excited on a media level and on a general populace level. But it's very quiet still in this particular cycle. I think we're early. I think, next year, 2025, I think we could easily see Bitcoin at 200, 250, 300 even. And if we do a Bitcoin strategic reserve, then we're going to $1 million. So I think we could have a very fast price appreciation this cycle. So far, it's been, very gradual. If you look at the leverage that built up in the system, obviously a bit got wiped out this weekend with Bitcoin dropping back. I think we had one of the biggest ever liquidations of near $500 million. But, these are all very healthy things. You need that leverage build up to get calmed down. And so we've not been particularly overexcited this rally at all. So we're not looking too overheated, certainly not on an open interest level. So yeah, I think we're very early in this cycle, and generally in the life of Bitcoin, I think we're still very, very early. Willie Wu, who I work very closely with on the fund that we manage, he thinks 400 million people own Bitcoin. Now, obviously, he's a data guy. He's looking at the blockchain all day long. And, I think he's probably right. But of those 400 million people, how many people are completely down the rabbit hole and really understanding what it is? So we're at 5% adoption, with actually way less than that really understanding and going, I want a major allocation to this asset. So I'd say just in general, Bitcoin, we are so early. We're so very early. I mean, even people, I was talking to someone this morning because we had a very pompous gentleman work in the board of my previous firm. And I remember she was the girl I was talking to this morning. She was a 27-year-old kid at the time. And she said to him, Bitcoin was trading at 3,000. She's like, Bitcoin's going to 100,000. He's like, Bitcoin will never go to 100,000. So I was just texting her this morning. I said, have you got your text ready to send him when we crossed the line? And she'd forgotten all about it. But for me, it had been very, very illustrative of that sort of old established, I've made all my money in traditional finance. The idea of Bitcoin, even though I'm on the board of a Bitcoin company, is really ridiculous, and it will never succeed, or governments will ban it, all this type of stuff that you hear. So yeah, I think we're super early still in answer to your question.
Do you think the 4-year cycle continues as we go forward?
Yeah, great question. I think if we get a Bitcoin strategic reserve, then that 4-year cycle and, the drawdowns that you see go with it, I would say that it's very, very muted going forward. I think that will be the thing that busts the cycle. A lot of people talk about the aggregate change of stock to flow being the thing that kills the 4-year cycle. I don't actually agree with that. I think that whatever flow there ends up being actually could still define the cycle, because it will just be so impactful, and you're just going to have so much long-term holding that the liquidity on a day-to-day will be, aligned with the pricing and also the supply of Bitcoin. But what I would say is that Bitcoin strategic reserve will obviously create nation state FOMO. I am hearing more and more of every day about nations adopting this, quietly buying in their sovereign wealth funds. So, we're already going there. If Trump and the team end up announcing this early doors in the administration, or even, I think realistically they're not going to probably do it in the first 6 months. They're going to have quite a lot on their plate. But even if they do it in 2025 at some point, I think really that's the end of the 4-year cycle.
And in the meantime, Michael Saylor with Microstrategy continues to buy. He just bought another 55,500, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Michael is the Fed put, essentially, in the Bitcoin space. He's planned to buy the entire annual supply of Bitcoin for the next 3 years, essentially, with his 21 and 21 program. He's obviously ripping through that ATM a lot faster than 7 billion would imply, i.e. 21 broken into 3 years. So I think what's going to happen is he's going to do that whole ATM possibly in 3 months rather than 3 years. And then he's going to issue another one. The bond component, I would imagine, will be a lot slower, because he's got to manage the debt proportion If you think about how much Bitcoin he owns and you think about how much debt he has, he's got to be thinking of an LTV ratio that could sustain a very heavy drawdown in Bitcoin. I mean, he's currently at I think he's $7.5 billion of debt. With today's purchase, he's at 40 billion. Is that right? 40 billion of Bitcoin. So if Bitcoin draws down 70-80%, then he's at his debt level. That's probably the biggest drawdown we could anticipate, unless something completely explodes with Bitcoin. But I don't think we were going to see that level of drawdown anyway with his bid in the market, as you suggest. I mean, I can't see an 80% drawdown happening, even if another FTX type event happens. It'd be very hard to see that.
And is Microstrategy a company that you invest in?
Personally, I'm an investor in Microstrategy. That's not what we do at Seas Capital. We don't invest in stocks. There is a bank part of Seas, and then many of the clients, I believe, have Microstrategy as part of their portfolio, but it's normally within advisory or self-directed. So yeah, I'm a personal holder.
So tell us a little bit about Seas Company and the mindset of your hedge funds clients and how Bitcoin aligns with their goals.
So Seas Capital is a $1.8 billion alternative asset manager. So the part that I look after is hedge funds. Within hedge funds, we allocate to hedge funds. So some of those hedge fund managers are our clients because they come to us and they say, I want to invest in Brevin Howard of Millennium or whoever it might be. So that's what we do on our hedge fund advisory desk. So we have about $1 billion in hedge fund advisory. We have just over $100 million in fund of funds. And then we have a white label product, which is another 200 million or so of assets, where we essentially provide the engine to someone else's hedge fund business. Within that fund of funds scope, we have a fund of crypto hedge funds. And so the way that our investors use that, often they are people that are very heavily exposed to crypto, or they might just be a family office that wants to put some toe in the water around crypto and have a lot of the volatility taken out. So for example, in a month like this, where crypto is doing very, very well, we'll make 3-4%. In a month like April, where you had a 25% drawdown in Bitcoin and a God knows how much drawdown in broad crypto, we were down 50 basis points. So we protect capital to the downside, we participate a little bit to the upside, but that's a much lower volatility product, obviously, for a family office, that where the father doesn't want to touch anything in crypto and the kids are giving him a hard time, right? This is a nice generational meet in the middle type product. And then on the private equity side, we buy companies across German-speaking Europe, so Germany, Austria, Switzerland. And we're really looking at lower mid-market companies where we can be investing at a sort of 5 to 6 times EBITDA, and then through various growth strategies, working with the company. And we were not one of these stripped down private equity firms, just leverage the company with debt and then just try and sell them. We do work with these companies for the very long term. Generally, they tend to be family-owned businesses like our business. Seas family alignment works very well when we approach these companies, because normally what's happening is, again, the father or mother are running the company. The kids don't want to take over, so they have this sort of continuation issue. And so we come in and sort of work with them in terms of transitioning and taking them with us on the continued journey for the company. We also have an overall flagship product that we help people allocate broadly across lower mid-market Europe private equity. So we're looking for fund managers that are exceptional. We're very performance focused. So we're working with fund managers that are making 7-8x return. We don't care about the Blackstones, the KKRs, all of these big guys that charge you crazy fees and produce basically hedge fund returns on 10-year product. We don't want that at all. We're looking at proper returns that are covering you for the cost of debasement. In fact, everything that we look at Seas Capital, we have a minimum target IRR of 15% in the longer dated stuff. And then the liquid stuff, obviously the fund of crypto hedge fund, it's above 15% target IRR. But in our traditional hedge fund portfolio, we're looking at cash plus 3-4%. And then we also have a litigation finance bucket to what we do. That's a strategy that not many people really understand. And a lot of people think you might be ambulance chasing with that type of a strategy. But what we're really doing, we believe, is social good. So, for example, I'm not sure, you mentioned you live in Miami, Paula. Let's say a chemical company down the road were irresponsible with the way that they were getting rid of their waste, and then they were, polluting the water supply. You, as a resident of Miami, would have a potential litigation case, but you, as a small individual, might not be able to take on someone like Dow Chemical. Right? We then step in, we pull people like you and other people together to take a huge litigation lawsuit against these big companies and make sure that we get a settlement for people like yourself. And so then, we take about 40% of the proceeds of the settlement, and 60% is given to the victim, even though we've funded the whole thing. So that's to just quickly understand litigation finance. But that's a really nice product. It's completely uncorrelated with markets, as you can imagine, because, whether markets are going up, down, or sideways, you're still settling lawsuits, right? And so you don't need an exit. You don't need an IPO market. You're just settling in the courts or outside the courts. Anyway, I guess that's a little off topic from your Bitcoin focus, but that's what we do.
Well, it's interesting to hear. And how many of your clients have you managed to bring into Bitcoin?
Yeah, so it's happening more and more. Obviously, I am talking about Bitcoin all day long, and it's becoming more and more of a relevant conversation to people. But, when you talk to a family office, they're not going to go and allocate 100% of their capital to Bitcoin. So we talk to people broadly in terms of how do you allocate capital to make sure that you're preserving capital for generational wealth. And obviously, the more they understand Bitcoin, the more that allocation becomes. So we have had a particular family office that will remain unnamed, but they didn't have any allocation to Bitcoin when I first started talking to them. Now they're almost at about 50%. Now they're a small family office, but they're very, very into it. They've done a lot of work and they've spent the time, and so they're now, they're pulling away from some of their private equity allocations to be allocating to Bitcoin. And this is just something that we as Bitcoiners have been in the space for a long time. We completely anticipate, this is what's going to happen. When you've got an asset like this, more and more people want to have a heavier and heavier allocation. But as I said, with the volatility, you can't, certainly if you're, trying to preserve generational wealth and pay for, kids' education, houses for the family members, these types of things, you can't have it all in Bitcoin. So there is always a discussion around allocation.
And what is your most effective way to orange pill friends, clients?
Yeah, I like to explain it as right here, right now, you have a vote. You have a vote on how to store your capital that you've worked your entire life for. You can choose to store it in a system where a bunch of old people in a room get to decide how much of that paper gets printed every year, therefore how much you're going to get debased. Or you could store it in an asset where that asset is completely finite, is controlled by no one, is predefined in an algorithm, and everybody understands the very clean and structured supply curve that is happening to that asset. And that will continue to be issued over the course of the next 116 years. You choose. And so that's the vote that I give people. And I'm finding more and more that that's the thing, that's the very simple thing that resonates with traditional finance people, because that then leads you on a journey, right? Because if you have that choice, the response I often get is, of course, but. And the but means I don't understand that what you said about that second system is completely true. The minute you do understand that that's completely true, it becomes very obvious. It's an of course, right? I want to store my my time and my value in that. Imagine you get to the age of 60 and you're at the point of retiring, and suddenly there's a war in some country miles away, and the controllers of your currency decide they have to print 20% of the currency to fund this war. I didn't vote for that. I don't want that. But I'm having to fund it, and it's taking 20% of my hard-earned retirement money, which is being debased. So I think it becomes an of course. Of course I want it in the system, but can I trust the system? And so that is when you're at the edge of the Bitcoin rabbit hole, is how do I trust that that is true? There you begin your journey.
Down the rabbit hole.
Indeed.
Do you think some high net worth individuals don't see a need for Bitcoin because they're doing pretty well and they're okay with their returns?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I hear it all the time. I'm too old. I don't need to get involved in that. I've made my money. I make my 4% every year. That's okay. Yeah, of course. Happens all the time. But, when debasement rate can reach up into the 20, 30% annually, you got to be a pretty good investor to be outperforming that every year. So I think that of course it depends. If I'm talking to someone who's 75 years old, it's not worth arguing the point. The point I will make, though, is, well, do you have kids that are going to be inheriting from you? Do you have grandkids? Maybe you want to think about having one Bitcoin for each of those kids. I mean, obviously that as we go higher and higher, that will be a more unreasonable target for people. But up until this point, generally, your average Swiss high net worth individual can afford to buy one Bitcoin for each of their kids or each of their grandkids.
Yeah, that's a good approach for the grandkids. So do you see CBDCs affecting or coexisting with Bitcoin?
I'm quite against CBDCs, and I really always try to encourage people to understand what they are. I, like many people, back in my early days of being a crypto person, I was like, oh yeah, the blockchain, it can be used for CBDCs. What a great idea. But the more that you look at it and the more that you realize that, governments don't always make the best decisions. And, anything that, to be honest, could be well-intentioned, can end up with very bad outcomes for a general population. You only have to look to China and China's experimentation with CBDCs, which have led to much better enforceable social credit scoring systems where you can't spend your money in certain places if you did something which the government perceived to be antisocial, like jaywalking, which is a punishable offense in China. And they have pictures of you walking across as a pedestrian crossing, saying this person crossed at a red light, and you're up and shamed. And, when you combine that with the CBDC that can be used to control behavior, that's a very scary dystopian path that we're going down. And I look, the ECB made an announcement a couple of days ago about the work that they're doing to try to build this e-euro or digital euro. And it's like, well, who voted for this? Who wants this? It's like, why are you doing this? Why are you spending billions of dollars of essentially European taxpayers' money to bring something that nobody wants? Nobody wants. If they explore it carefully, nobody wants it. So, I'm very pleased to say that the Swiss National Bank are very sensible about this. They've said that they will not have a retail CBDC. The only CBDC they will possibly have will be at an industrial level to just manage flows from the national bank to the broad regional and cantonal banks. But they've said regularly on record, there's no need for a retail level CBDC. And I think that's because Switzerland is a country where there's a lot of thoughtful behavior around policy. Obviously, it's a country where referendum is rolled out for anything that people want to, that the government wants to make a decision on, that people get asked to vote. And I think, when you're operating in that way, you can't just run these silly projects like the ECB are running that nobody wants. You have to get a validation from the voter base. And so, CBDCs, I did a podcast recently with Mngr where he spoke of the ills of that. And I really have to agree with him. I'm very concerned about it. And I do worry that because of general population understanding of things like Bitcoin is quite low. So I think we have the risk of sleepwalking into this dystopian future. And so it'll be very hard, by the way, to buy Bitcoin when there is a CBDC. It'll be very hard to buy it because you'll be having to get your money in and out of that system. And I can pretty much guarantee they won't be supporting fiat on-ramps to the degree that they do currently on these crypto exchanges.
That's a good point. What narratives do you think have to shift in Europe to get more Bitcoin adoption there?
Well, obviously, I pay close attention to what's happening in the UK. And, I get calls all the time from people in the UK. How do I buy Bitcoin? My bank won't let me send money to Kraken. My bank won't let me send money to Coinbase. I mean, it's remarkable what the FCA have done in terms of really just shutting down all possible avenues for you to buy Bitcoin in the UK. So I think, and I don't know if this is because, and this is the problem with crypto, this is why I am a Bitcoin maxi, is because so much of crypto is a scam. And so it's fair enough if you're a regulator to say, well, we've got to protect people because there's so many scams out there. And, generally people are greedy and silly and they'll make bad decisions because they're greedy and they're FOMOing into some nonsense coin. So I can understand why the regulators have taken this position, but I think there should be a clear distinction. This is why I like Relay so much, because they are a Bitcoin-only brokerage firm. And the problem with Coinbase and the problem with Kraken is they have a load of these gambling coins on there, which is extreme venture capital, where you could lose all your money. And, with the advent of these meme coins, I mean, these are just, some of them are full-blown, well, of course, they're all pretty much scams, but some of them are entirely intentional scams. They'll do anything to pump up the coin so they can then sell all their coin and take their money. And I think, this is why, if you're a regulator, I can understand that you're trying to shut these on-ramps because crypto is letting everybody down. If regulators made a distinction and said to Coinbase, you can have a license to be a Bitcoin-only exchange in the UK and you can do as much business as you like. But the minute that you're offering all this other nonsense, I'm sorry, you're going to be regulated by a load more laws. And I think that is fair enough. But, until that happens, it's going to be very, very hard for a regulator. When I say until that happens, until Coinbase themselves probably lead and say, we've got a Bitcoin-only product, it's going to be very hard for a regulator to understand that distinction. So there's a gentleman called Freddie New, who you may want to talk to on your podcast at some point. He runs Bitcoin Policy UK. We're going to have a chat towards the end of the year, but I think this is the way we need to lead the regulators, is to help them understand that if you distinguish between Bitcoin and crypto, then actually you can have very sensible regulations that can encourage Bitcoin, that can help people actually save for their kids' future. And if people want to gamble, they need to understand that it's full-blown gambling and, it's whatever regulations apply to casinos. That's what we should be looking at rolling out there.
Do you think for some regulators or many regulators, Bitcoin is like another side rail? It's another monetary asset that is actually challenging their monetary asset, because we are leaving the euro and the dollar and going into Bitcoin, which, as we all know, the people closest to the money printer benefit the most. So do you think they're aware of that, or is that going to come later?
Well, I don't know if you saw the paper that got released by the ECB about Bitcoin about 2 months ago, I think it was. There the central bank is very scared of Bitcoin. And they're doing, I mean, there were elements of that paper that were utterly crazy. They were basically telling you Bitcoin price is going up forever, but you should not buy it. And in fact, you should try and push towards it getting banned in your particular jurisdiction because it's unfair that people that are early adopters should make money. I mean, it's insanity to read something like that and imagine that people might take it seriously. But, people do trust what institutions tell them. That's one thing about Bitcoin is, you realize there's more and more that people just blindly trust. I remember going to a barbecue at my son's girlfriend at the time. It was her father's house. And we went there, and he always used to introduce me as the Bitcoin guy. And I remember getting introduced to all these 70-year-old, very nice Swiss people. But the first comment was, Christine Lagarde says Bitcoin is bad. Why on earth would I invest in Bitcoin? So I was like, I don't need to talk about this. I'm here for the hamburgers. It's fine. But yeah, people do really trust the institutions. Yeah. So to your question, sorry, I didn't actually answer your question. Do I think regulators are trying to stop it because the central banks have realized that it's an asset? I mean, that's a fine line. I don't know if you're a regulator and you're being told by the central bank to ban it because that might. I've never seen any sign of that. I've spoken to a lot of regulators in this space, and we've done a lot of. In my previous firm, we did a lot of education of regulators about what's happening and how it's happening. So I would be very surprised if that type of a conversation is directly happening. Of course, the central bank has influence, and these people tend to go to the similar type of functions. And when they have the head of the central bank come and speak at one of the regulatory events, he can be dismissive enough, or she can be dismissive enough that obviously it sends a message to the regulator. Oh, I don't know if I want to be too pro Bitcoin.
Tell us a little bit about being an advisor to Jan 3 and how they're accelerating nation state hyper-Bitcoinization.
Yeah, so look, I think the endeavor of Jan 3 is a very admirable one. Samson is obviously trying to make it viable to run around the world and educate governments. They're not at the point of paying people yet to do that. That will come with time. I think that the key is helping nations understand, and this is where Samson and his team can become very effective, is helping them understand how to structure financing around their natural resources that essentially can provide energy infrastructure. Once you demonstrate that can be done, and you can raise financing out of that to build more infrastructure, to back it with Bitcoin or pay a coupon in Bitcoin or whatever it ends up being, you then set the way for billions of dollars of financing for countries that are really under the cosh of the IMF to do the same. Because with Bitcoin mining, as you well know, you have a constant buyer of energy, which allows you to expand energy grids, exponentially. And so once you tick that box and you go, okay, let's do a financing. It was very much like Michael Saylor's journey, right? I want to buy Bitcoin because fiat's melting. Okay, actually, maybe I could borrow some money and buy a bit more Bitcoin. And then now he's at the point of just running this violent treasury operation. And I think that you're going to get that phasing of nation state adoption as well. Once they realize that not only can they get free of the IMF debt, but they can they can turn themselves into an energy rich nation very, very quickly, with being one of the first people to adopt this style of structuring of finance, then, really it's going to become a domino effect situation. And, I'm very, very happy to be working with Samson and the team as an advisor to help them on that journey, because I really think it's an admirable one.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear, because as we know, Bitcoin is for everybody and can help everybody all over the world. And that's wonderful. How has Bitcoin changed you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it does change people. It's definitely made me more long-term mindset. When I was a kid, I was actually very good at saving money because I grew up in a period where interest rates were quite interesting. So I had a building society book, and I used to put cash in the building society, and I didn't ever want to spend it. I wanted to just see it grow and grow. And so, we've obviously moved away from that time with the exponential expansion of monetary base that, kids today, they actually don't value the paper money at all. I mean, I remember when my daughter got some money from her Swiss grandfather, and I found the 20 franc note on the table. A few days later, she'd just completely forgotten about it and become completely disinterested about it because you don't really understand, but instinctively you do, that money is just less and less valuable as time goes by. And I think that what Bitcoin is doing is changing the world back to a longer term mindset type world. My daughter now, she earned a little bit of money for doing some work at her school. And she's like, Dad, I want to put it all into Bitcoin. And all her friends, went out and bought it, spent it on clothes and stuff like that. She was like, no, I'm saving it in Bitcoin. And so, that was a really proud moment for me as a father that she's getting it. She's obviously, poor girl, has to sit and listen to me talk about it at the dinner table whenever we have a guest over or on phone calls at the weekend and stuff. But yeah, she's obviously getting a little bit colored by it. Yeah, I think it makes you longer term mindset. I've become healthier as well, pay more attention to my diet, my fitness, just thinking about what do you want? You want to be there for your kids in the future. You are thinking much further into the future. It's not like, can I survive? So yeah, I think it gives people hope. And that's why, when you see the amount of mental illness that there is in the world today and the suffering that people go through, really, I believe that, you and the work you're doing, Paula, with your podcast, it's just so important to help more and more people understand what this is, because it can give people hope. It can give people hope for the future. The future's bright. It shouldn't be something that you're scared of whether or not you're going to be able to pay for your meals. Like, the future's exciting, and fix the money, fix the world. I believe it.
I love that. Just for our last question, has Bitcoin changed you spiritually?
Oh, well, that's a very long answer, I would say. But yeah, I would say so. I I had a psychedelic journey in 2022 when I was in Costa Rica, and I couldn't help seeing many similarities between the medicine that was very clearly some level of a spiritual being with Bitcoin, which is some level of consciousness. It's like, if you think about human knowledge, right? Human knowledge all pulled together is some level of consciousness. So the internet could be considered as consciousness. That's why AI could be considered as consciousness. When you have so much input into this network, it almost feels sometimes like Bitcoin is breathing, right? There's something there and viable. I think that Bitcoin is a gift to humanity. I think it does take people on a spiritual journey. I think psychedelics are also a gift to humanity. It can help you see issues with yourself that you've never quite understood. It's very hard to be objective with yourself. So introspection can be challenging. And I think psychedelics sort of take you on that journey much faster. And I think Bitcoin also takes you on a journey. It takes you on that journey, as I said, to a longer term mindset. And that is a spiritual journey. But I believe that there is an argument to say that there's a level of consciousness here that whoever Satoshi was, be it a she, he, or a group of people or an alien, it was a gift to humanity that was given. And it was so perfect in its conception that I find it very hard to imagine that this was just by luck. This is the perfect asset. It's the perfect thing to take our world forward. And I think it comes at a very important time. The fact that it was launched literally, as Lehman was collapsing. And that is just crazy. And, at the same time as, several things in the world going quite wrong, more and more people understanding psychedelics and being, curing some of the mental illnesses that come with the challenges of our society. All of these things seem to be happening at the same time. I think it's an upgrading of the world's consciousness. And I think Bitcoin is a very important component of that.
Yes, I agree. It absolutely is a gift to humanity. Wonderful. Well, Richard, tell us where people can find you.
I'm on Twitter at Richard Byworth. The podcast is Seize the Future, spelled as Seize Capital, SYZ. It's on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and Fountain. So it's everywhere that you go for your podcasts.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Paula. I really appreciate the chat and being on the show.